Hello, everybody, and happy Monday. Welcome to CHLY 101.7 FM, and you're listening to Act 3. My program talks about all kinds of really groovy stuff that are happening within the community, and we're really delighted that you've joined us today. In the Zoom booth with me, I have Jeremy Mailloux. I'm sure I've said his name wrong because I always do when I'm under the crunch. At the end of the day, I'm delighted that he's here and he is with AVI. Welcome to the program, Jeremy. How are you doing, my friend?
Thanks, Kathy. Good morning. I'm doing wonderful. We're having a great weekend here.
I know, right? So I think that, people are starting to be quite grateful that that sun is happening. We were so cold for such a long time. Isn't it wonderful that we finally get some sunshine into the deepness of our bones?
It is.
Jeremy, could you tell us about how you got involved with AVI? What is AVI? All of that kind of groovy stuff.
AVI stands for AIDS Vancouver Island, and historically, we are an organization that was formed by the LGBTQ community to combat the AIDS crisis back in the late 80s and early 90s. We've gone beyond that. We still work around HIV, but we do work around hepatitis C, homelessness, addiction, queer health, gender affirming work, and we kind of cover everything that we possibly can at this point in the game. Um, uh, 4 years ago, I came in to participate in our PrEP program. PrEP is a medication that can prevent you from acquiring HIV. And for
Yeah.
me, I found out it was too late. I came in and you have to get tested first, and I found out I was HIV positive. So after I got finished dealing with that news and, adjusting my life a little bit, I decided to come and work for the AVI as an educator and health promoter. So and to continue in the fight that my community's been doing for decades now. So I'm
No
lucky to be part of
kidding.
it.
Well, congratulations on this new role with AVI. I don't think it's all that new at this point anymore, but still congratulations. We're glad that you're here. I'm a person of the 80s. Unfortunately, I can date myself quite comfortably. And what I know for sure is in the early 80s when it first came out, it was a very, very difficult conversation for many people. First of all, LGBT2 spirit queer communities weren't accepted as it was at all, let alone on top of it having such a serious condition as HIV or being diagnosed HIV positive. But I even remember when herpes first came out, because that also was one of those things where when herpes came out, it was an LGBTQ2 spirit. It wasn't as understood as it's long understood now. How did that feel for you to come from that time period and the evolution of these diagnoses today as we know it?
There's a cavalcade of feelings when something happens like that. Some of them are positive and some of them are negative.
Yeah.
So for me, it really felt scary because it reminded me of back in a time when I saw my friends dying. Even though I know that's not how things happen today, HIV is a
Yeah.
manageable disease in the modern world. It's
Yeah.
more like diabetes or something along those lines than it would have been back in the
Yeah.
90s. So we've got some really good medication now. So I wasn't afraid for my life.
Yeah.
But I was definitely afraid for how people would interact with me. All those specters of stigma, rose back up. It was really weird after being, out of the closet for 30 plus years to be back in the closet for a moment, and
Yes.
to,
Yes.
have that hard discussion with folks. But I was really reassured that my community had laid the foundation. The fact that I had a place to go to get tested, the fact that I had a doctor and nurses and a care team that were looking after me is something that my community built over decades.
Yeah.
So I feel lucky that I have the AVI, but in my heart, I know that it's not actually luck. It's the culmination of a lot of people's hard work. So I'm really glad to be able to be part of that now and give a little bit
Yeah.
back to the community. Yeah.
Do you find this that there's still a stigmatism towards it, or has it loosened up at all?
I think I think that particularly with what we've seen in the past couple of years around things
Yeah.
like COVID and more recently around monkeypox, it's easy to say that stigma doesn't exist. I just get to do whatever I want in my life. Stigma actually does still exist. And you're sort of seeing that in some of the conversations we've had around both those other public health crises.
Of
It
course.
yeah. So there still is a fair amount of stigma in the world. Things have clearly improved from the 80s. You know, service providers like doctors and nurses are still on it. But the number of people that don't know that HIV is a chronic manageable illness that doesn't progress into AIDS typically anymore is surprising. And I mean, doctors and nurses often are marginally aware of it. So there's still some work to do in the community.
Is it still considered to be an LGBTQ problem as it goes for problem? I mean, I'm using that word very specifically because of the stigmatization that goes with it. And so without, going too far into a rabbit hole, I'm really quite curious about how people are relating to this now,
Sure.
especially since it doesn't turn into AIDS any longer. How are people reflecting on community?
Now that we have sort of a way to control HIV, we've been able to expand our sort of circle of care to include the other bloodborne illnesses like hepatitis C, and to sort of include some of the intersectionality that is involved with HIV.
Yes.
So although it is a disease that affects the gay population and the trans population, not so much the lesbian population these days, but although it is a disease that affects our population, it doesn't know any borders in terms of bodies. So women are the fastest growing group, for instance. They have larger increases year on year for diagnoses. So
Wow.
yeah, and at the clinic, we work with lots of men, lots of women, lots of people from every walk of life. So it doesn't know any boundaries. HIV is not homophobic. It picks
Yeah.
on anyone.
No, no, no. And I think that's an important thing to say, because I think that for so many years, people thought that it was a gay disease. And again, I apologize for that. And I think if it's okay with you, and I really want to let you know that I am very ignorant and I know it, right? I'm not unkind, I'm not rude, I'm not mean, but I'm ignorant for understanding, particularly now. And I think that our listeners may also be, some of them, not all of them, right? I think that there's a good population of people that are a little bit further ahead. But for myself, I know that what I'm seeing is an ever increasing acceptance of the LGBT to spirit community. And again, I apologize, I'm even mumbling over to saying it because there are so many letters that I'm finding myself wanting to be inclusive and making mistakes in along the way. And so if it's okay with you, I just would like to help people to understand a little bit about what this all means in the way that today's society is receiving it. We are so much more accepting of all people, all genders, all races, all religions, all faiths, all things, which is terrific. But very often we don't know how to talk about the pronouns, or talk about, like, help me out here from that regard. Like, what is that? I mean, I know it's all, I don't mean to throw this all on you, Jeremy. I really don't, but I'm curious.
Well, I do a gender course for service providers, and it's generally about 3 hours, but it's not a super complicated, it's not actually a super complicated topic.
Sure.
If you have an LGBTQ person in your life and you're curious about how you should address them or if it's okay to ask about something, those are conversations that are okay to have. They're absolutely fine to have. And Kathy's just given everybody a really good example of how to politely approach the topic. Hey, I may be wrong because I frequently am, but I have a couple questions. Are you okay with that? So asking for consent to have that conversation, if you receive it and you have it, I mean, that's a great thing to do. Trying to look something up on the internet about somebody that you know is really hard. So looking up how to cope with them, it's much easier just to turn to them and ask them, hey, what's the best
Absolutely.
way that I can do this? The
Yes.
vast majority of folks are going to look at your intention more deeply than your words. So that can help you quite a bit. Just in the sense that if your heart is in the right place, often people will forgive you many little errors. And what do you do if you do make an error? I work with folks of all different genders, with all different pronouns. I work with folks that have different orientations and come from different walks of life. And if I make a mistake, I apologize and I move on. If I say something that was either maybe careless, I apologize. I own my words, and I move on. I don't. Nobody has to. Nobody wants you to throw them a parade because you insulted them or something, right? Or because you
Right?
accidentally said something,
Yeah.
wrong. So really
Yeah.
addressing it in the way that is the most gracious and least embarrassing for the person is probably the nicest way to do it.
And I really appreciate that. And I appreciate the permission to ask permission, right? Like, I think that there's something to be said for that. I'm very blessed in my life that I'm surrounded by a number of people, a couple who are trans, who are in the middle of shifting over into different but same people. And so I know that one person in particular, and I won't put out any names or anything like that, but one person in particular was a male for many, many years and now sees herself as female and she identifies as female. And so there's a consistent, in my household, we do correction in a very gentle way. It's like, no, she, right? If another family member says he, we gently say, and so without embarrassing anyone, we say, no, she. And then we use the pronouns that she's asked us to use around her, and when we're not around her as well, if that makes any sense. So I think that it's important that people feel safe enough to open up that dialogue and to say it's okay for me not to know. Another thing that I'm interested in, because of your work with AVI, is the AIDS crisis as we know it today, because you've mentioned earlier in the conversation that AIDS doesn't necessarily turns into HIV, pardon me, doesn't traditionally turn into AIDS any longer. But we're still seeing in some countries of the world huge numbers when it comes to AIDS. Do we as Canadians, do you know, are you aware, are we helping to facilitate change and support those that are still in AIDS crises in other areas of the world?
Well, we are and we aren't. In Canada, we like to pat ourselves on the back and say, "Oh, we're doing a great job around
Right?
things like healthcare," and often we are. But there are cases where we're not, and sort of one of the areas where we're not is around legality and immigration. So
Yeah.
it can be very difficult to immigrate if you're HIV positive.
Mhm.
There's different rules if you're from a country where HIV is considered endemic to the region,
Yes.
which right there creates a barrier to entry for people that need it the most. If you come from Sweden, we're not that concerned. If you come from a developing country, suddenly there's a little extra barrier. So right
Indeed.
there, there's still like, some nuggets of racism that are utilized like this, and many laws around HIV are utilized in that way. So laws around things like disclosure, where most people that have HIV in the modern world aren't able to transmit it. So it's undetectable, untransmittable.
Yeah.
We're able to get the virus to such a low reservoir in the human body that even if there's blood to blood body contact or fluid exchange, you're not able to transmit it. So currently, myself, if I were to have unprotected sex with someone or give them a blood transfusion, I wouldn't be able to transmit HIV to them, even though I'm still technically HIV positive. The law hasn't quite caught up to that. Around things like disclosure. So even though I know for a fact that I'm not able to transmit, I have to disclose to partners because I can be charged with things like fraud or sexual assault if I don't.
Yes. Yes.
So when I say it's a little bit like diabetes, it's a little bit like diabetes, but nobody ever got charged with fraud for not telling their lover they're diabetic, for
Right.
instance.
Right. Right.
So we haven't quite caught up in some of the legalities around that sort of as a society, and that's kind of some of the work that we still have to do coming up.
Yeah.
There's plenty of other areas too. So the one thing that I'll point to, and that I like, living in a medium-sized population center like Nanaimo, the world is not at the same place when it comes to healthcare. So Canada is not at the same place when it comes to healthcare. The healthcare that I, as a gay person, might receive if I lived in downtown Vancouver on Davie Street isn't the healthcare that I might receive in Nanaimo, and it's definitely not the care I'd receive in Campbell River or Port Alberni or a more remote
Sure.
location. So we
Yeah.
talked about PrEP earlier, and PrEP is inaccessible at most places. Most doctors don't give it out. It requires blood work and there's a lot of barriers around PrEP. very similar to the barriers that had been around birth control, for instance, in the late 60s and early 70s. And the conversations we have are the same. Oh, we don't want to give PrEP to gay men because that will cause them to have promiscuous behavior. That sounds familiar, right? That
It
sounds very
does.
familiar.
It
That's the
sounds so
birth control
familiar.
conversation.
It is exactly the birth control conversation. You betcha.
Or MSRP only covers it if you're considered high risk. So
Yeah.
before we're able to have MSP cover the cost of it, a person has to already have assumed a huge amount of risk. They can't take it proactively because they're charged for it personally. So these are some of the ways that we need to catch up. Like PrEP should be a human right. We can do it.
So
Yeah. Go
before
ahead.
I, and I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I don't like interrupting my guests. My apologies. But when I think about PrEP, can you just do me a favor and break down, is PrEP a medication? Is PrEP a delivery model of learning about the
Sure.
condition? Like what is PrEP in itself?
Sure. Thanks for catching me there, Kathy. It is really hard not to use jargon sometimes. I'm in the
I do it
clinic
all the
all day.
time. Yeah.
So
Thank you.
PrEP stands for pre, so that's the P and the R,
Mhm.
exposure, prophylaxis.
Okay.
So we call condoms prophylaxis. Prophylaxis means preventative. So it's
Right.
a before exposure preventative. So what it is a medication. You're going to take one pill a day, and it's going to cause you to be unable to acquire HIV. There's a long explanation of how that works scientifically, but essentially we're adjusting a protein that allows HIV not to infect your cells, kind of a deal. So
Understood.
as long as you're on this medication, there's a 99.9% chance that you won't acquire HIV if you're exposed to it. We use the same medication plus a few others for post-exposure prophylaxis or PEP. So this is what we would give you if you had a needle stick injury or a sexual assault or any sort of exposure where you're not sure about the other person, but you fear that there's been risk associated with an interaction.
Yeah.
And that's amazing in this world that we have a solid cure for this. It's a working
Yes.
cure is what we refer to it as. It's a medication you would have to take forever right now.
Mhm.
But there are some things coming down the medical cycle that hopefully will change that, in the coming years. We just don't know
Sure.
when.
Of course, and anything to do with combating these kinds of things does take a lot of time. A lot of science goes with it, and they don't want to just give a pill to somebody and then hope that this will work without doing some appropriate testing, right? And that always takes time. So you had mentioned very eloquently about healthcare services, what you might receive in downtown Vancouver versus what you might receive in more remote communities like we are here. How far ahead, not far ahead, how far behind actually are we on the island for having these medications available?
That really depends. I don't want to paint a doom and gloom picture.
Of course,
I want to actually underline some of the successes that we're having. So
indeed.
the First Nations Health Authority, for instance, makes this available across the board and covers it for
Wonderful.
anyone. This is one of those examples where when you give people control over their own destiny and
Uh-huh.
over the things that are important to them,
Yeah,
good decisions get made, right?
indeed.
So
Absolutely. Mhm.
FNHA has been ahead of the curve on this for ages. They approved it before the province did. They paid for it before the province did. That's really wonderful. I guess it would really depend on an individual too, because there's also functions of class and socioeconomics here. So
Indeed.
even if I live in a remote place, but I'm fairly well to do, it's not really a big deal to go to Vancouver to see a doctor that I need. If I live in a remote place and I'm not particularly well to do, I may spend the vast majority of my time in that community. Um, it's going to be a crapshoot. So right now,
Yeah.
and say
Yeah.
let's use Port Alberni. I don't want to pick on them. I love you, Port Alberni. Um,
We love you too.
but right now in Port Alberni, as a
Yeah.
queer person, if I was 17 or 18 or 19 and I didn't have a family doctor, there isn't any place in Port Alberni where I could go and get PrEP. So there's not a public health unit that has it. There may be a few private doctors that are offering it to their clients only, but
Yeah.
that's not the same, right? That's not
Yeah.
the same at all. So right now we can get those kids HIV tests, and that's it. We're not really offering anything substantive to help their sexual wellness. and people still get diagnosed. So that's the kicker, is that even though it's a controllable disease that we can stop from spreading, people are still getting diagnosed every year.
Yeah,
So there's still plenty of work to do, and the diagnoses come from remote and marginalized communities typically.
yeah,
So if you think it's bad in Port Alberni, imagine being in a remote reservation, for instance, and trying to access medicine like that when you may be
yeah,
related to the people that work in your medical clinic, for instance.
absolutely,
And
absolutely.
it might as well be 1850, or it might as well be 500 years ago for the level of access that they have to modern medicine in remote communities. So really a challenge for us, and something that you're seeing bigger organizations focus on.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's coming again, but slowly.
Well, the good news is that it's coming. First of all, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom in this regard, because I really, there are things you don't think about. I'm just, and again, to the positive, not to the negative,
Yeah.
but the awareness factor that we need to actually have. People are very busy with their blinders on, right? We're so used to living our experiences from our own lens, and until we're actually walking in the lens of other people, we don't always understand why or how things are affecting them very differently than coming from another part of society. My curiosity at this point then is, when we think about how to serve people and support people, what does our community really need, and how have we been effectively trying to support people with HIV? And I also want to talk about the connection between hepatitis C and HIV, because I hear those coming together a lot, but so that's another little piece of my question. But before I get there, how are we supporting Nanaimoites and people on Vancouver Island at this point through the services of AVI?
There's a couple of different prongs. So there's obviously the part where we seek funding from the government, right? So
Mhm.
that is a great way. The Public Health Department of Canada is one of our funders. Island Health. We'll work with anybody. Just put it out there. Uh, when it comes to achieving funding, we will, anyways.
That's for
And
sure.
then there's the down on the ground stuff. So AVI is a part of the community every day, and we do direct service providing to people. So we have a wonderful outreach team that goes out in the downtown core, for instance. We have a
Yeah,
great medical team offering things like primary care, STI testing, sexual wellness access, and then, of course, the things that we're doing around addiction models, right? So we've
sure.
just offered enhanced harm reduction, and that's all going really well. But the part that I really love to focus on is the people that have been sort of coming out of the woodwork, so to speak, and especially with the Shine fundraiser coming up, it's
Of course,
really
yeah.
put our names back on people's lists. So right now we have many practicum students, so it's really wonderful when we get somebody. Let's say I want to be a community mental health worker, and I get to do a 3-week practicum, and I can ask anyone in the city. We're getting asked a lot now, and we're finding that people are coming for the right reason. They're not just trying to get their 2-week education thing over and done with. They're
Yeah.
showing up saying, hey, I'm here to work in the community. I see what you guys are doing. I see your team out there handing out food. My friend came here for an HIV test. So we're starting to hit this critical mass where people are showing up from the community with ideas already in hand,
Yeah.
wanting to volunteer or wanting to work around the things that we do, wanting to offer things like support. We got some support from the co-op recently, just as like a good example. I love those guys. They do so much good work in the community, and they gave us $1,000 for Boost, for unhoused people, for
Fantastic.
direct nutritional support in the spot. We work with Nanaimo Food Share as well. Hi Tabitha, you guys are wonderful. They do incredible work.
They
So
do.
we collaborate with them to put food bags into the hands of folks that genuinely really need them.
Yeah.
And for folks where fresh, clean food is going to actually make a big difference, both self-esteem wise and then health outcome wise. So there's a lot of things that we're doing. We're finding the more it goes, though, the more we're drilling down to the basic fundamentals of housing, nutrition,
Yeah.
and basic, equitable healthcare. We're looking
Absolutely.
for that equity, right, to bring us up to the Vancouver level, I guess, or
Yeah.
not to pick on them, but
No, but I think that, what I'm delighted to hear about and what I'm so excited to understand is that AVI is no longer just, being pigeonholed into this is all we do. The world has changed, we have changed, Nanaimo has changed. We have a huge population of homeless people in our community. We have so much to deal with when it comes to mental health and addictions. And the good news is that there's an organization like yourself that's there that helps with not only the education facilitation, but on the ground, boots to ground supports. And so I find that that's, completely exciting, very necessary and needed in our community. We're just kind of at the halfway mark of the show, and so there's a little bit of a segue that I kind of want to move into, and part of it you've already mentioned a little bit, but we're going to start with that segue, and then we'll come back to it in our conversation. If you have just tuned in, it is time for you to go get a piece of paper and a pen, because you are going to want to write down Jeremy's information for AVI. And you're also going to want to write down the information for Shine 2022. Shine 22 is the social event of the season. We are delighted to be a part of supporting our community, and AVI is the recipient of the funds from that night. So we're going to talk about that when we come back. But before we do, please make sure that you grab your piece of paper and your pen. And if you're watching us on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe, push that button to the right-hand side. We are always delighted to have you here. So thank you so very, very much. We are, if you just tuned in, as I said, you're listening to Act 3 on CHLY 101.7 FM. In the Zoom booth with me is Jeremy Mailloux. He is with AVI. And in a few minutes, we're going to give that information that you lovingly texted me just a moment ago. But people got to grab their pen and paper before they do. Let's talk about Shine for a little bit, shall we? Oh, yay! This is so exciting.
Very exciting.
So exciting. So tell us about how you got involved with Dean Tholner, who is going to also be our guest next week on CHLY. How did this all come together?
Well, Dean has been, I don't want to steal Shine's shine, so to speak.
Of course.
But Shine isn't a new concept. Dean
No.
is been doing this kind of work in Vancouver. He is well known in the community, in the HIV community. The West Coast is sort of a bastion of HIV
Yeah,
research and activism.
absolutely.
We have the Pacific AIDS Network here, for instance, and Dean is somebody that the minute I started doing this kind of work, his name would come up over and over
Of
and over
course.
again. We had some intentions to launch Shine earlier, but then, of course, the COVID happened, and that meant that we couldn't gather together. But what it did mean is that Dean had some time to really plan an incredible event for our first
Indeed.
one.
Yeah.
The amount of money this man has raised for HIV and mental health is astronomical. We're so blessed. This is the first time we've done a fundraiser of this caliber.
Yeah.
Since we started over 20 years ago, this is probably going to be one of the largest things. As someone who works around HIV, sometimes you get a little depressed because, there's a lot of other sexier pandemics now. So it's right.
So true.
It was the Pepsi of pandemics, definitely. So
Yeah.
so it's really nice to see the focus sort of come back, and to remind folks, there's still a lot going on here, and there's still a lot we can do, and still a lot we have to do in terms of the health work. So both of those aspects, the fact that this is the biggest thing, but that this is also probably barring the beginning of the crisis in the 90s, this is probably one of the most important times to bring something like this up and to remind
Yeah.
ourselves that we need to be focused on public health as a community, because and holding our politicians accountable and making sure that people know what we need. Often it's just a voice. So, the politicians may not be aware that we need PrEP in Port Alberni, for instance.
No, exactly. And I think that that is really a critical component to everything that we do. I mean,
Yeah.
educating is not just educating community, it's educating the decision makers and the financiers that are able to help push the agenda forward, particularly when it saves lives like this does.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Uh, and we really are sort of keen on the idea that mental health has always been a big part.
Huge.
I think we all know that in the medical system right now, we may get to your body. So we might get to your body. If you've got a dislocated knee or something, we're going to fix that. If your heart is bruised, we're not going to do that. If you have depression or stuff, we're like, we'll give you a pill, maybe kind of a deal. So this focus on mental health and on sort of a holistic view of wellness where it's actually your mind and your body,
Of course.
and your heart too, because we really try and fill the social component too with different types of programming like hikes or meditation classes. Any excuse to bring people together and help them create connections and support each other, to address that mental health component, which is often missing, particularly around the specialized type of medicine we do. So that's kind of a really amazing thing about Shine. The mental health component is really going to be a strong aspect, and I think a lot of people are responding to that as well.
Yeah, yeah. 1 in 5 people will struggle with some form of mental health concern, as they walk through their lives. And so I think that it's really critical. I think that some of the systemic issues that we have within community, in all communities, really are based around mental health and that misunderstanding of how we can actually facilitate wellness in a much, much different way. It's very easy to support somebody when you know they're walking around on crutches, or people were very supportive of me. My community knows, our community knows that I was very ill for the last 2.5 years. I was very, very, very unwell. For a long period of time, I was walking with a cane because my body was hurting so badly. And so people were always coming up and, hey, Kath, how are you doing? Oh my goodness, you look so, tired. Or, how are you doing? Like it was very easy to identify with my illness, even though they didn't know what it was. They could identify because I had some visible proof that there was something wrong. Mental health, on the other hand, is very, very quiet and very insidious because as quiet as it is, the depression level for some people can also turn into the very deep, deep darkness. And, we need to be aware that, we don't know what somebody else's story is. We don't know what they're going through. And it's more than just being gentle and kind to community. We know that that's necessary, of course, but it's more than that. We need to put some money behind supporting people that are going through challenging times and find solutions. It's more than just throwing money at stuff. It's being there to hold space. You mentioned as well, that you have some other programs like meditation programs and things like that at AVI to help support. Is the community at large participating in those, or are those in particular to the clientele that you're working with using those services?
So some of our programs like nutritional supports are very earmarked for people that are, that need it more.
Yeah, of
And
course.
that's just because of lack of resources. If I could give everyone a food bag every week, I would totally be delivering them.
You and me both.
Our other type of the other types of supports that we're doing. So when we're doing a programming support, it is occasionally what we would call siloed. So it's very for a specific group. So for
Yeah,
instance, I do an LGBTQ youth group that is siloed just, based on age kind of a deal.
of course, of course.
The majority of the programming that we try and launch is as inclusive as possible. For me, I tried to launch things like when I first started, I tried to do things like HIV specific support groups and stuff. And what I found is rather than putting people into a tiny little box, that works a lot better when as many people can come together as possible. So we
Mhm.
actually we try to make things inclusive in the sense that anybody can come and join it. You don't have to, if you want to come to our meditation class, we have Dr. Brecken who runs it. He's really wonderful, does a great job, and anybody is allowed to come. You just have to sign up and come on down to the class, for instance. So those types of things. The same with the hike. It's arbitrarily an LGBTQ hike, but there's no test or anything. We
No,
don't.
I was going to say, do you have to walk up with your card that says, I am
Yeah.
LGBTQ2 spirit? Here you go. Let me in.
If I have one piece of valuable information, it's that we don't get those cards. There's no meeting notes. When a new letter gets added, no one calls me. That's
No, no,
it's,
right? As absurd as that is, right? I think that there's a segment of all community that really have this expectation. Aren't you going to tell me what that is? I don't understand that. I never have understood that. It's just leave them alone. Like let people be.
sometimes, we're all trying to do good stuff. Most of those
I
things
know,
come from really strong intentions,
of course.
but it can make it really confusing from the outside to sort of understand what's going on. So, wait, there's a new
Yes,
letter. I think what you see is a bunch of folks just trying to do their best to make sure
I know.
everyone, gets a little love.
Yeah, and we want everybody to have a lot of love, that is for
Yep.
certain, especially when we know that this community, there's so much going on with it. We just really need to reach out and do the very best we can with what we have, and just to be kind and present wherever possible. I'm curious about, we started to talk about the hepatitis C thing a little bit ago, and I just really want to jump back on that because I often now, as I mentioned earlier, I see the two of them together a lot, and they're very distinctively very different. They're very different conditions. So, can you help me understand what, has there been a strong increase in Hep C, or what's going on with that?
Sure. Hepatitis C is often controversial thing to talk about, but arguably less controversial than HIV. So
Yeah,
why would we be focused on? There's plenty of other diseases we could have picked to match up, but why would we choose hepatitis C? The reason why that's a part of the work that we do is because it's also a bloodborne illness.
right.
So they have very, very similar mechanisms in terms of transmission. So it's very easy for us to address the same sort of topics, right? It also affects primarily marginalized people. It is a sort of chronic liver disease. It's the best way to
Okay.
describe it, kind of a deal is you have a chronic liver disease, and over time, your liver stops functioning as much, causing problems with your system. That's sort of the bird's eye view there.
Yeah, yeah,
It affects many of the marginalized populations. So when we started working with folks that are experiencing homelessness or working with addiction, that because it's a bloodborne illness and you're using injectable needles in those scenarios, sometimes it's transmitted often amongst the drug using population. So it's already impacting them. That's something that we're absolutely going to take on.
yeah.
So we do a clinic around hepatitis C. We work with one of the drug companies, and hepatitis C is sort of controversial because we won't always treat it. It's another one of these things where not we, the AVI, will treat it anytime we can.
Yeah.
But it's actually very hard for folks with hepatitis C to get treatment. They often have to convince a doctor that they're stable enough to get treatment. The treatment is expensive. So it costs the government a lot of money to treat it. And if the doctor doesn't feel that the client is going to take their medication all the way through, then the decision will be made sometimes not to treat that person until they're more stable. Because if you stop the medication halfway through, you have to start it all over again. And this is another one of those examples where we're really deciding what dollar value to place on a quality of life.
Yeah.
Very similar to PrEP, very similar to how we're sort of distributing the monkeypox vaccine right now, right? So the monkeypox vaccine is only going to folks that are considered extremely high risk. So they have to have a certain number of partners, and they're being asked this when they're getting the vaccine. So
Can
this
you
notion, yeah,
can you actually, for those, I think monkeypox is still very new. Recently, I've heard some commentary over the news that says that it's predominantly hitting the LGBTQ two-spirit community more so than mainstream community members or different community members. Again, pardon my ignorance. I really do not
yep.
like to be foolish in the way I distribute people as a whole, because I do see us all as one community. But at the end of the day, the monkeypox vaccine, the many conversations that I'm hearing are really that monkeypox is sort of relating more in that. Do you have any insight on that? Is that a bunch of hooey, or like what are your thoughts towards monkeypox as a whole and the way that we're able to treat it moving forward?
Whenever we talk about populations, like specific populations and specific disease states that are moving through, we always run up against the risk of marginalization, right?
Indeed. Yeah,
So there are often times where we don't want to talk about things, or we may downplay them, or as a society, not as a clinic, that we is not the
of course.
AVI, for instance.
For sure. For sure.
But where we will downplay them, or alternatively, where when somebody is marginalized and vulnerable, certain populations will upplay them. So
Yeah.
In 2022, this is how we're seeing monkeypox behave. It is a contact illness. So it's moving between people that are having body contact with each other. It unfortunately came out as Pride Month was starting in Europe. So there were a lot of large gatherings, and it is not a sexually transmitted infection. It is nothing particular to gay people. We just drew the short straw this time.
Yeah, understood.
Yeah, and that really is it. It's actually
Yeah,
not limited to the population. So there's a lot of controversy going on right now about how this discussion is happening. There's a party of people that want us to be warned. So there's some of us that remember back to HIV when the government really just wasn't saying anything, right?
mhm,
So we're like, oh, if there's even a suspicion this is circulating, we need to publicize this. And then there's another camp that's saying, hey, very similar to calling COVID the China flu kind of video. If we keep doing this, if we keep putting the focus and saying, hey, it's prevalent amongst it, or saying gay men are spreading it or queer people are spreading it versus it's impacting their community, then we're creating stigma, right? And we're going to make monkeypox into a gay disease when the actuality is it's not. The vast majority of people that have had monkeypox historically aren't gay, or if they were, they just happen to be gay, right? This is a
yeah, yeah,
this is a virus that has had a reservoir, for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's been on record, so this is not a new thing or emerging from the gay population. It's a contact disease, so it's no different than things like scabies or things of that nature that can be passed skin to skin.
yeah,
So chickenpox essentially.
yeah,
And
yeah.
I guess if
Shin,
it was
yeah,
chickenpox, we'd be looking at it different. If chickenpox goes through a grade school, we don't think, oh, it's a children's disease, or oh, it's a public school disease or something like that.
right?
So
Yeah, yeah. No,
yeah,
yeah.
and where it
And
goes remains to be seen.
no, but I think that that's incredibly important that we identify that. You're quite right. The fact that it landed at the same time as parade did is more coincidence. And, and of course people are going to run with that because, people are not necessarily the brightest all when it comes to fear, right? This is a fear-based condition. All the COVID-19 has done is created an even more strong level of fear in people. And we just need to be more educated about all of that. Speaking of education, I am so delighted, Jeremy, to have you in the booth. Folks, if you have just tuned into this really fabulous conversation, I feel like I'm talking to one of the most eloquent people in a long time about such an important issue. So thank you, Jeremy, for being in the booth with me today here on Act 3. We told people we were going to give their information out. So I think it's really important. And I'm going to get you to do it, Jeremy. How would you like to let people know how do they reach you? How do they get involved with AVI? Let's go into that for a few minutes, if you don't mind.
100%. That's fantastic. I really appreciate that too. So we have a website. It's avi.org. So avi.org. I'm gonna be upfront with you all. We're a nonprofit. It is not the greatest website, but it does give you a rundown.
But I love it. Like, we're not spending our money on stuff. We're spending it on people.
Yeah, any IT volunteers out there want
Yeah,
to jazz that
rock
up
on. We
by
need your
by all
help.
means. So that's one of the ways, and there's links that you can connect with us there.
Yeah,
And also our phone number is available. I'm going to give out our phone number, but I'm going to do it hesitantly. I'm going to remind folks that we are a nonprofit with a limited number of folks, and we're really focused on
yeah.
providing medical care for people. That being said, you can call us at 250-754-9111. Um, Another way to get involved, if you think that you would like to do volunteer work or you'd like to do something like a student placement at the AVI, or you think you can help, you can reach me directly at my email address. And it's a tough one. I've got a pretty long last name. So it's Jeremy, Jeremy dot Mailloux, Maillous, as in X-ray, at avi.org. I am sure that Kathy has some links.
Absolutely.
So I'm sure there will be some links underneath, but that's Jeremy Mailloux at avi.org. Um, and those are probably the three best ways. I can point you in the right direction if you need care, or if you just want to help out, either one of those things.
I'm so delighted to have had you on the show today. We're not quite done yet. I want to like shout out a little bit more about Shine,
Hmm.
because the money that is raised at Shine, it's the hope in this community that we raise $100,000 for mental health and addictions. All the money is going to stay here, right here, local in Nanaimo, and 90% of it is going to AVI, and 10% is going to the Flow program with School District 68. So the good news is that all the dollars are going to be spent right here helping mental health and addictions, and AVI is going to be the steward of those funds. And so we're so excited to know that your organization has brought so much to our community and has sort of moved along with the transitions and the changes that community has brought over the last while. Um, how excited are you about being at the event? I'm already like, I'm like, yay! I can't wait to
Um,
be there.
we can't stop talking about it in the
I know.
community.
Yeah. It's
Beg your
so
pardon, I
important.
just had to clear my throat there. We
No
have
worries.
not stopped talking about it in the community. If you know an artist or singer or musician or makeup artist, ask them if they know about Shine, because dollars to donuts, they do.
Yeah.
I've had so many people say, I'm going to be in this fundraiser. And then I say, oh, what's it called? And ta-da!
Ta-da!
There is going to be some incredible acts. And what I love is that we've not flown in, you know what I mean? We've not flown in an act from Los Angeles or something. There's lots of great, really famous people. These are all folks in your community that are already doing work in your community. So the sort of synergy here is incredible. Many of the acts are coming from very personal places. A lot of the folks performing are folks that utilize our services. So there's some really wonderful synergy happening there. And it is incredible to think about my community being on display for a night, particularly after COVID, right? We've been waiting
Yeah.
so long for this.
And another reason why I'm calling it the social event of the season, because we've all been in lockdown. And so not only is this going to be a huge party, a huge celebration, people coming to the stage on their own terms, living life the fullest on their own terms and sharing it with our community. It's like, it's mind-blowingly fabulous.
I think the outfits you're going to see just in the crowd alone, like, so just in the audience, I think some of
Yeah.
the outfits,
Yeah,
not to be frivolous, but we deserve a little joy in our lives.
we do.
Some of the outfits I think you're going to see are going to just really knock you over, and the performances are going to be stunning from what I can hear. I've yet to see any secret performance, rehearsals, but I'm trying to get in. I think I
You
think
and
it's
me
going to be a
both.
wonderful night. And to
Yeah,
see the
yeah,
convention center used for such a big deal, this is
yeah,
one of the larger events we're going to see at the convention center this year.
yeah.
So good for downtown Nanaimo. It's not just good for AVI, right? We
It's good for
we are
all of us.
located in the core, and like
Yeah.
you said, all that money is going to go back to things like feeding the community, providing frontline healthcare for people, making sure there's a nurse available when they have a wound, and so on and so forth. So um, it's all for a really great cause. We're so grateful for Dean and Vanessa and the rest of the team over at Shine. So
Yeah, it's pretty outstanding stuff. And if you want to know how to get your tickets, because they're selling out fast, like really fast. So you really want to go right away. All you have to do is go to www.togetherweshine.ca. That's www.togetherweshine.ca. We're also on the cover of Nanaimo and Voyager magazine. There's an incredible story about Dean on this third page, I think, as you go into the magazine. So by all means, get your copy now. They're available everywhere. By all means, have a little bit of a read and make sure that you're doing it. Nanaimo and News Bulletin is also putting something out for us very soon. And of course, here on Act 3, you can watch our program on Upfront on Shaw Cable 4. Jeremy is one of the guests on the program. You will also meet Dean through that program as well, and through our Act 3 television show as well, which is also a shameless plug for our program, which is on Shaw Cable 4 as well. Brand new episode is coming out this week. So, there's so much excitement that's going on in community to support mental health and addiction. Most people who listen to the program know that as I come towards the end of the program, I'm always looking for that little bit of wisdom, that kernel that we can imbibe on the community. And I don't mean to throw you under the bus, but I ask everybody the same question. If you could teach somebody something about your experiences with AVI or personally in this last while, what would that message be to our community?
The message that I would have, it's the same thing that I told the folks that work at the clinic. You can't know the consequences of your kindness. Have gentle solidarity with the people around you, and everything else will work out. You just can't know the consequences of the kindnesses that you do in the world, so don't hesitate to do them.
I love that. It's so true. It's so true. Something so simple. People often feel invisible, and your being kind to that person makes them visible even just for that moment and can actually change the trajectory of their lives. So
It's
thank you
true.
so much. That's great advice.
Thanks
Great
for your
advice.
kindness and generosity, Kathy. We
Ah,
appreciate you so much in the community, madam.
that's so very kind of you to say. I feel so blessed and so lucky every day to know that this community is being supported by people like you, Jeremy, and by your organization and all of the things that you're doing. You know, for Dean as well, and Volume Studios and all the things that he's doing for CHLY that allows us to have a forum that we can talk about difficult conversations over the air. There's a lot of people that really make this community an incredibly great place, and so thank you to all of them and to all of you listeners. Jeremy, thanks so much for being my guest today. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in to Act 3 on CHLY. Once again, I remind you, please subscribe if you are listening to us on YouTube. Check us out on Shaw Cable 4. We air 4 times a day, island wide. Please, if you have a chance to watch some of our programming, go ahead and do so. You'll be really glad you did. In the meanwhile, we'll see you next time. Have yourself a fantastic week, everybody. And remember, be kind.